Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello, I'm Claire Pales and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. Today's guest is Anna Leibel. Anna, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Last time was for episode 21 and we did a live podcast on stage, which was so much fun. As a long-time listener would know, you are the Chief Delivery and Information Officer at UniSuper and also a board member at Ambulance Victoria. We'll put your full bio in the show notes, but Anna, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Claire. I loved the podcast last time and I was very thrilled to be welcome back.
So I wanted to invite you back on the podcast because there was lots of topics that we didn't cover last time and the world has certainly changed since we last spoke. That's probably putting it mildly. It's also probably a great place to start. So we've been all thrown into remote working for the last couple of months. From your perspective, what do you think has been the true impact on teams?
I keep thinking back to New Year's Eve and thinking about the start of a new decade as well as obviously a new year. And I never expected 2020 to be like this. For me, the positives from a team perspective has really been the ability to demonstrate remote working at scale. And if I talk about UniSuper specifically, we've actually had the tools in place to work remotely, but culturally we like to go into the office and work with each other and collaborate. And so for me, it's being able to prove out the ability of the technology to perform at that scale, but also for the teams to actually continue being productive. I do think that if there wasn't trust there with the teams prior to working remotely on scale, you can't build that trust once the people have left the office. And so for me, that's something that I've been reflecting on a lot. And I've been really proud of the team for continuing to meet their commitments during this time. It also has helped our executives, so the CEO and the executive and also the board understand that the business can continue to operate whilst working remotely and acknowledging it is heavily dependent on technology. So we've continued to deliver on all of our project commitments for FY20. We've continued to hire critical roles. So that's been interesting, really challenging us about how we onboard new starters and being mindful of the experience that they have around induction. But we also had a significant amount of work to do around the early release of Super initiative, which the government released to help support all of us during these times. Another benefit that I've found is that all of our meetings are starting on time. And so when we're in the office, and we do have 90% of our employees within the one building, which is unusual nowadays, we actually usually start meetings up to 5 minutes late as we're always in lifts, moving between floors to get to other meetings. And so one benefit is that we are starting all of our meetings on time. The challenges, I suppose, is that we've shifted those conversations you might normally have in a lift or while you're queuing up to wait for your coffee at the coffee shop or you bump into someone in the kitchen, is that we've moved those or changed those into meetings. And so people are feeling like they are having more meetings. So that 5-minute chat's being scheduled now. So I think you lose just how nice and informal that is. And people are feeling like they're on Teams pretty much all day. And the other feedback that we've had from some of our team members is not feeling comfortable switching off. So at the end of the day, there's nothing else to do. We're all at home. We're all isolated. So a lot of people are finding they're just putting in some extra hours. But one productivity gain that we've had is people are enjoying not having the commute. And some of them are using at least part of that commute time to actually do some work and catch up on work, which we're finding really beneficial from a business perspective.
It's interesting you talk about the informal conversations in the lift or in the kitchen because oftentimes as a security leader I've found that sometimes when people see you and think, oh, I needed to have that conversation with you and so security possibly has been impacted by not being at those kind of hallway conversations. And from your perspective, do you think that for security and tech staff those particular types of leaders or employees have been impacted more or less by the shift off-site?
I actually find and have always found that technologists are very adaptable. And relatively low maintenance, Claire. Like I think about our ability to move floors or work in different conditions. I'm old enough to think back to Y2K, where a lot of people had to sleep in office buildings or like caravans, vans that they brought in for the night just to get us through that situation. And we're used to working through unusual circumstances. You know, if we need to fail over to a DR site. And so I've found that the technology teams, both obviously IT, but security specifically for this podcast, have transitioned really well. I think it's worth acknowledging the increased volume of work for the security teams, and that's not just for UniSuper. Through the media, we're seeing a significant increase in breaches, and we're seeing those nearly on a daily basis at the moment. So I know that our team in particular has been working and very mindful, so more working through different shifts. So really thinking about how we can service the business more. But I put 2 plans in place to support us working remotely. And the first one that I did was to put in a heightened change control process. I was really mindful that with having everyone working remotely, you're even more dependent on your technology systems, both the performance of them and the availability of them. And we're running all of our board meetings on Teams at the moment. So if we were having some performance issues, that would have a significant impact on the business, as well as our ability to service our members and employers. So the heightened change control process, it was interesting the feedback that I had from some of the people within the team, and that was that I was over managing that process. And so that was a good reflection for me that I had to be mindful of really explaining why I was putting that in place. And when we first started, I actually had it set up as a separate approval process. So I got feedback that was also slowing the business down. And so how we adapted that, and we did it really quickly, was actually just have my leadership team actually go to the change board every week. And so we now sit in and listen to all of those changes get presented. We have the opportunity to ask the questions around whether we're happy that the appropriate testing's been done, and even that we've got the business lined up to do testing as well. So we've had a really good result based on that. And I'm also then mindful as we start to transition back to the office when we actually then lighten up on those approval processes as well. But the other thing that I did, and we actually put this in place just as we were leaving the office, was I was finding that we were having multiple incidents that we were needing to manage concurrently as we hadn't worked remotely en masse before. And a really good example was once we had an incident we were working through for our investments team, as well as trying to work through another issue with a connectivity issue around end user computing. So both were really important to the business. Previous to that, we were good at running one incident at a time. But we then had to really challenge ourselves and our ability to run multiple incidents concurrently. So prior to leaving the office, we actually established 4 different incident response teams with a very different skill set to what we usually see. Our incidents are normally more around our applications, whereas moving remotely, it is more around either the end user compute, it's around the network, it's around the security tools. And so we actually built out these teams that we could pull together very quickly, because I was mindful we're all going to be working remotely, but have representation from each of the domains. Now, what that also let us do, if we ever had an incident that ran for more than 8 hours, we could actually then bring another team in.
I think the benefit of that too is there's so many learnings from this current time. Just as you said, putting the en masse off-site working alone, I think has taught a lot of businesses a lot of lessons, but seeing what your staff are capable of is pretty incredible as well.
It's been a really rewarding process for me, as I'm mindful that often the work we do in IT, people actually can't see. And so some of the work that we get to do, like implementing a new CRM or rolling out a new digital capability for our members, are things that you get instant feedback on. But when you're actually doing work throughout the technology stack, which is more around your networks or your infrastructure or your security controls, that's all work that we do that the business don't really get to see. And so the capability is now being recognised from the board and across the executive, and really our ability to continue to work productively remotely.
I want to move directions a little bit. There was a couple of things I really wanted to ask you last time we met, and one of those was around focusing on your security leader. What are the types of things that you like to keep track of when it comes to security? And I guess what are the key areas of interest that keep coming up for you with him or with the team?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's one thing that I really value in VJ, and that is that he sends me a list of agenda items or topics he'd like to discuss with me at least 24 hours before we have our regular one-on-one. So he's really good at, I suppose, managing me, which is lovely. But also I find that valuable because if I need to go back and reflect on his email, so if a month has passed and I need to go back to something, an update he gave me, I can actually then look back on those emails. But for me, VJ and I have a very informal relationship, and we have our formal meetings in the diary, but we also talk on a very regular basis. And I like that he knows that I'm there for him when he needs me and vice versa. And so the types of things that we do talk about, and there are regular topics, is really around checking in on how we're going on the in-flight projects that we have to uplift our maturity around security. That's measured overall around the NIST framework, so really checking in on that. And VJ is very structured in the way that he approaches the capability around security. So we're implementing a 3-year strategy. We're 2 years into that. And so VJ makes it very easy for me to be able to understand where we're at, what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then what's coming up next. At the moment, obviously, the discussion is more around the planning for next financial year, which will be the final year implementing our original 3-year strategy. Always checking in around how the team are doing, especially at the moment where they do have a higher volume of work and working different hours in terms of working in shifts to support the business. But really also around attracting and retaining staff. So we're continuing to see that as a challenge for us. We find that if we do have someone move on, it's really challenging within the market at the moment to source those skills. But the other thing that we talk about a lot is stakeholder management and communications. So as part of working remotely, we did make a call as a business to actually block the use of Zoom due to some of the security concerns that were raised in the media. So VJ manages all of that from a communication perspective across the business, and also then putting the controls in place to block the use of Zoom. So he does that sort of work around stakeholder management, but also we made the decision to really protect the performance of our remote working by also blocking some external websites and applications like Netflix, Facebook and YouTube. So we were mindful we wanted the UniSuper workplace tools to be used for work. And that was even more important at this time as we really didn't know how the system was going to perform with, up to 1,000 people working remotely. But the other thing that VJ does really well is keeps our board and also our executive across any other security trends, so emerging threats or trends or breaches that are actually happening, and not just in financial services, because I think it's really important that we can all learn from what's going on with other organisations. And so he will do a summary and send out an update to the executive and gives verbal updates to the board on what we're learning through different organisations.
So you've had VJ on board for a few years now. What do you think some of the key things are that CIOs should know or educate themselves about if they're embarking on a role that has the CISO or head of security reporting to them?
I think to be an effective IT leader today, full stop, you need to be curious. So you have to have an ongoing desire to learn. And I think technology changes so quickly. So it's not even specific to security itself. I think what's a little bit daunting about security is the implications, the business implications if something doesn't go well. And so for me, I am curious. I do like reading about emerging trends. And so I don't rely solely on VJ to educate me. I do that myself. I think that's part of my job. But also to really understand the current exposure. So VJ did a great piece of work when he joined UniSuper, and you helped us with that as well, Claire, around what I call a current state assessment to really help understand how we had to prioritise our work. The development of the strategy and the framework is really important to help me understand how we're going to measure our effectiveness and also prioritise our work. Networking is a really important piece as well. But I also think it's the ability, and I have this with VJ. VJ doesn't judge me if I say to him, I don't understand. Can you either say it again to me or can I play it back to you? I do that a little bit, but he also gave me the feedback after our live podcast. He said, you actually understand what I do, which made me laugh. I was like, yeah, I do.
So you're now, apart from obviously leading the security leadership, you're also now leading more than half of the organisation between the tech team, project delivery and operations functions, which I guess is similar to the scope of a COO role now. I'm guessing that you have quite a few smaller teams underneath you in that group. So what have been some of the great examples you've seen of team cohesion, and what traits do you think these teams have that make them really successful?
Terrific. So that you're right, the new business unit that came together last May, so it's been a year that we've been working together under the banner of delivery and information, is made up of about 40 teams. Now, I didn't know that before we went remote working, but I do know that now, and I'll share with you why. But the foundation for me in any team, regardless of size, is actually the clarity of accountabilities. And so it's really important that my leadership team, that their teams and also individuals are clear on what they're accountable for. I've always found that lack of clarity leads to business consequences, so that might be delays. But I think for me, from an engagement perspective, it creates frustration in individuals and also tension amongst teams. And so I have focused on making sure that people have clear accountabilities, but I also know that I'm not perfect. And when issues do come up, I get onto them really quickly and have been taught a process around how to actually establish really clear accountabilities and resolve those issues quite quickly. And so I mentioned this before, but pre-COVID, we actually have 90% of our employees working in one building. And so our ability to collaborate face to face was one of the things that made us very productive and successful. That was beneficial for us, but I think we took it for granted. And so we never really had to think about how would we make that effective way of us working transition to us all working from home. And so working through COVID, we are using Teams a lot. We had some stats initially, and we really did take great advantage of the tools that we had available to us. But I rely on a group of what we call cultural ambassadors. So we've got some volunteers across the business unit, which are really a grassroots cultural change program or movement. They have all volunteered to be part of that. And it was actually my assistant, Maria, that established the cultural ambassadors. And they really help me tap into what's happening for people day to day, whether we're in the office or working remotely. I test ideas with them. I test communication styles with them. So I actually find that as a really good way for me to get like a pulse check of what's going on within the teams and allows me to take action quickly if or when required. So last night, it's not a social club, but we're mindful that with everyone working remotely, we are focused more on how we can actually connect and make sure that we're not always connecting because of work. And so last night, the cultural ambassadors actually hosted their first trivia night. I was really, really bad at it, embarrassingly bad. But anyway, it was all because it was sport and TV, and I'm not a massive sport person, and also I don't watch TV, so I failed dismally. But one thing that I have done, and that's why I know that we have 40 teams within the group, is the first month that we worked from home, I actually went to every team meeting. And I'm about to do that again. But what I've also done, and this has got a really interesting and good feedback, is that I've set aside an hour every day where individuals within the team, and as you mentioned before, it's a large group, so it's about 500 people, can actually come and have a one-on-one with me. And at the start, for the first week or two, we didn't have a lot of interest, and I was sort of questioning, was it a good idea? But what I found is it actually then got started and it's built up a really good momentum. And what I also think is interesting and valuable is that we're not talking about work. Often it's checking in and just seeing how people are doing, talking about homeschooling, talking about recipes, how we're trying to keep up our exercise regime. So I found that as a really good, positive way to interact with individuals, and then attending the team meetings gives me that team connectivity as well.
It's funny because I think the question, how are you, is so much more loaded these days than it ever used to be. You know, that people's response to that can be anything from good thanks to well, and, kind of on they go.
Yeah.
I love the idea that you're reaching out to staff, and with a group of that size, I don't actually know how you fit it all in. And the next question is even more burden to your workload around some of the work you've been doing volunteering. And I know that you speak to grads on a regular basis and impart some of your wisdom. And we often find that we're telling grads advice, or certainly I am, that we probably should be reminding ourselves of regularly about our careers as well. And I'm interested to know what some of the advice you're giving grads that maybe our audience could probably all heed about career planning and taking our careers forward.
There's multiple ways that I try and address that. So if I'm actually talking to a group, one of the things that I have done, and you participated in it for me, thank you, Claire, was to do really short 1 to 2 minute videos profiling different types of IT roles. And for me, that's important to demonstrate different types of work that you can do within STEM or IT, and not just hearing from me. I think it's people are interested in doing different types of work, and hearing from you about cybersecurity is obviously a hot topic. We had another colleague that you and I both stay in touch with who is a digital leader. Digital's the buzzword, so everyone wants to be part of that as well, and working for some really interesting brands too. But for me, the advice that I give people is I sort of worry about our grads today and the pressure that society puts on them to make them feel like they can't make and when I say a mistake, it's not a mistake, but we encourage them to over-question the path that they're taking, whereas I think sometimes life just has a funny way of working out. And so for me, it's actually encouraging them to take risks and say yes to different opportunities. And one of the ways that I help support that is I actually invite people in to job shadow me. And I've had multiple graduates come and do that so they can actually see what my day's like. And people think IT is sitting at a desk all day in front of a computer. Now, at the moment at home, that's actually true. But back when we're in the office, it's walking the floor, it's going to meetings, it's meeting with vendors, helping solve problems, making decisions, going to project governance meetings. And so them being able to job shadow me helps them see what a day in an office is actually like. And I don't think that's just for my role in IT. I think that's more general around corporate roles today.
It's very hard to make a decision about kind of what you want to be when you grow up. And I think a lot of people come out of uni and still don't know the answer to that.
Years ago when I was working at Telstra and I participated in the graduate interviews, so for the graduate intake program, I met with so many graduates and all of them had done exceptionally well at school. They had multiple hobbies like sports and they'd been encouraged to have a very full resume as well as a part-time job. And I actually felt sorry for them because I think they had so much pressure to succeed. It's just an interesting dynamic. I grew up in a household where my parents just wanted my sister and I to be happy. And they encouraged us to choose our career path, but they would have expected, regardless of what we chose to do, they expected us to give it 110%. Giving it any less would have been unacceptable, but we were free to choose what we wanted to do.
Yeah, it's such a different time for grads, I suppose, now more so than ever, because, you were talking earlier about onboarding people in these times where you can't actually even go into an office. And so, I think for grads it's going to be a whole new world. I want to finish by going to the other end of people's careers, from grads to the board. So I wrote a blog last year asking the question of, how many CISOs truly know the role of the board? But the opposite is also true. How many boards really, truly know the role of the CISO? And there's been some research this week, actually, from the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and they were suggesting that just 3% of board directors have STEM or science, tech, engineering and maths as their backgrounds. And we talked a little bit about this last time you and I met when we covered cyber knowledge for directors. And the Governance Institute has also released some research around this. And they had a piece in the AFR called, Board Members Are Male and Pale. What's your reaction to all this research around diversity of background, gender? How do you think the makeup of boards actually impacts tech and cyber? I know this is a big question, but there's a lot going on in this space at the moment. So I'm really interested in your opinion.
There is a lot. And I think if you and I could solve this, Claire, would be millionaires. For me, I think this is part of an overall shift. And so the data doesn't surprise me. I actually feel in some ways just pleased that it's actually getting the airtime. And we're now thinking about whether we have diversity, and I mean diversity of thought. So it's not just gender, it's not just the STEM experience, it's also age. So you sort of mentioned then you're going from one extreme of a career of being a grad to the other. I also think we've got to break the stigma of it being a board role being the end of someone's career or towards the end. And so for me, I think the shift or the dependence on IT now for every business will just continue to increase the need for those skills on boards. And I think that's just a shift of the profile. So you do your skills matrix of your board. And I think prior it was very clear on what organisations would look for, particularly around governance. There was strong representation from law on boards. And I just think it's something that we'll start to see shift, and that actually motivates me. I think that's a real positive. And then once you get the seat on the board, I think it's how you can actually play that role. You might still be the one with the STEM experience, but collectively as a board, it's the role to govern IT and security issues, not just the person who's representing STEM on that board. So I think that's something that's mindful for me, and I think something that we just need to consider as we do start to see that position grow more or become more popular on boards.
And as always, with diversity and inclusion, it's about having the right people there, not because they are diverse or they do meet a quota or any of those things. It's that they are the right person for where the board is at that time for the skills, as you said, in the matrix that need to be filled. Anna, thanks so much. I could talk to you all day on these topics. So I really appreciate your time once again on the podcast. And I hope everything goes well for the rest of isolation and look forward to seeing you back in the office really soon.
Thanks for inviting me back, Claire. Take care.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework and sign up for my newsletter. If you loved the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.